So in Genesis chapter 39, one of the things that we found out the last time, and we talked about the issue of how Joseph is a picture of Christ, and a lot of things are going to continue on with that, and we'll see that momentarily. And we talked about the connections that Joseph and Jesus Christ had, and how he is a picture of him. We talked about the fact that they were both loved of the Father, they were both hated by brethren, they were both conspired against. They were both slain by kin. Now, of course, we talked about that last time. Joseph's brethren conspired to kill him, but they actually didn't do that. The first time that they show up, they're rejected by ignorance. And then the second time they show up, they're going to be recognized. And we'll see that a little bit more as we go through with Joseph here. But if you remember at the end of chapter 39, what we found out is Joseph is tossed into prison, right? And he was innocent. Potiphar's wife claims that he tried to take advantage of her, and Potiphar ends up throwing him in prison. And one of the things that we found out about that at the very end is we see that we'll just read chapter 39 real quick, verse 20 through to 23. Notice it says, "And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him mercy, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made him to prosper." Father, we thank you for the opportunity that we have to study your word, and as we take a look at this information, may we just allow the words to speak for themselves, to stand where they stand, speak to whom they speak to, and we just come to a greater knowledge and appreciation of your wisdom and your plan, that we might be to the praise and honor and glory of your grace. And it's in Christ's name that we pray. Amen. So when we look at this, one of the things we talk about is Joseph here. He's suffering innocently. He's placed in confinement. But one of the things we talked about that last week is that ends up being, it's almost like a road to power and glory. And we'll see that specifically today, starting off today, and then going on into chapter 41, depending on how far we get. One of the interesting things about Joseph is you see, and again, this is another one of those connections with Christ, you see the issue of a life of suffering and glory, right? And one of the things we've talked about before is Jesus Christ, knowing the suffering that was coming, he endured the suffering, knowing the glory that was on the other side, right? And that's one of the things that we take heart in and say, well, when something happens in life, when we suffer through something or go through things, what do we know is we know that there's something better waiting on us, and we understand that glory that's going to be revealed in and through us one day for God's glory. That's why Paul says what? For the sufferings of the present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that shall be revealed in us, right? That's his thought process, and most people today don't think that way. Right? They don't think that, well, I'm going to go through this, but, it's not worth anything, because when you're in that situation, for instance, I've got a former student that was just hit, even a hit and run, was killed this past week, and they were having his funeral this afternoon at the school. And the last 5 days for that family I know that has lingered slowly. And they're going through this, and it just doesn't seem like it's ever going to get to that point. But when you're going through things, you look at it and time slows down, right? That was one of the things that I noticed during the pandemic back in 2020. It just seemed like every day was just slower. You're like, we're never getting out of the 2 weeks, and the 2 weeks became whatever years and all that stuff. But then you look back on it, you're like, that didn't really take that long at all, right? Now we're on the other side of it and all those things. But we look at that issue of that suffering, but we really should focus on the glory that should be revealed in us, and not so much the suffering, get caught up in that. And that's what we notice here with Joseph. If you notice there in verse 21 of chapter 39, it says, "But the Lord was with Joseph." Isn't that a great position for Joseph to be in? And isn't that the reason why he can go through whatever he's suffering right here, knowing that there's going to be glory on the other side? Because what? God's with him. Does Joseph know that? He would by faith know that. And so then when we look at things and look at life and stuff like that, then we can do the same thing. Now, is God going to do the things like here he found favor, gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison? One of the things you're going to find out is no one in this world is going to give you favor. God's not going to manipulate somebody's will for that to happen. There was something specific that was taking place here. Because of what's going to be taking place a little bit later on. Now we get up here to chapter 40, right? In chapter 40 again, think of Joseph in the light of, you've got the life of suffering and glory. Chapter 40, we're still dealing with the fact that he's in prison, right? So verse 1, and it came to pass after these things that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. So you stop and you think, here you've got what? The king of Egypt, his butler and his baker has done something, and he's thrown both of them in prison, right? Verse 2, and Pharaoh was wroth against two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers, and against the chief of the bakers. And he put them inward in the house of the captain of the guard into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. Now, what do we know about Joseph in this particular case already is what? He's got favor with the guard, and the guard basically says what? You're going to run everything in here, and I'm not going to come and second guess it, right? And that's what he says back up in verse 23 of 39. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him. What is the keeper of the guard, or the keeper of the prison, what does he know about Joshua? Or Joseph, my bad. What's he know about Joseph? Thank you. He knows that the Lord is with him. That's something that he knows, right? As an Egyptian, he knows that the Lord is with Joseph. Notice, verse 2, he says, and the Pharaoh was wrought against two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers. And he put them inward in the house of the captain of the guard into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. Right? And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them. Now you stop and think about that for a second. He's already given him the rulership. Basically, you're taking care of everything in here. And here, what do we find out? He says what? The captain of the guard charged Joseph with them. And he served them, and they continued to season in ward. And they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. So here we've got the baker and the butler. Both of them are in prison. They both of them have a dream. And we're going to notice some things that come out of this. Notice in verse 6, and Joseph came in unto them in the morning and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his Lord's house, saying, wherefore look ye so sadly today? And they said unto him, we have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. Now, what's interesting is, if you notice that, what's Joseph's response to the two guys saying that they had dreams? And they don't have an interpreter. What's his response? Whose interpretation belonged to? God, right? Hold your place there. Go over to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2. One of the things that we see with Daniel, does Daniel gain favor with the king? Pretty much every king that he's under, right? But notice here, one of the reasons why is because of, let's start off in verse 14. All right, Daniel chapter 2, verse 14. He says, then Daniel answered with counsel and wisdom to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said unto Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree so hasty from the king? Then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. Then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time, and that he would show the king the interpretation. So what happens is you've got a dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, and Daniel says, well, give me some time and I'll give you the interpretation. Verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. So what is it that Daniel, his goal is to do what? He goes back to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and what is it that they do? They say, what we need to do is to pray that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret. And Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So they go in. What is it that they're going to do? They're going to pray for this opportunity. And notice in verse 19, then was the secret revealed unto Daniel. Now, who knows the dream at this point right now before you read in verse 19? Only Nebuchadnezzar and God, right? They're the only two that know this dream. Nebuchadnezzar's not gotten this. In fact, what he's done is he's gone through and he's asked all of his other people, come in and tell me what this dream is and what the interpretation is. And every one of them was like, well, if you tell us what it is, we'll tell you the interpretation. Right? And the reason being, if I tell you what a dream is, well, then I can come up with the interpretation. I can make it whatever I want it to be. But what he says is, what I don't want you to do is I want you to tell me the dream and then tell me the interpretation. And none of them do. And so that's why he's mad. And that's why he sends out his captain out there to kill all the wise men of Babylon. And in verse 19, then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. You notice that phrase again there, the God of heaven there in verse 18, it's verse 19. Drop down to verse 28. Daniel answers in front of the king. Notice what Daniel's response to the king is, but there is a God in heaven that what? Reveal the secrets and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. And then what he does is he gives him the dream and then he interprets the dream just as Nebuchadnezzar asks for. Who is it that the interpretation and all that stuff is going to belong to is who? Not just God, but specifically what? The God of heaven. Right? And that's one thing hopefully we kind of notice there. But that's what, if you look at verse 27, it says, Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, and the magicians, soothsayers show unto the king. He's saying that secret, back in verse 19, it's been revealed to him. He's saying, who is it that he got that secret from? Was the God of heaven. That's why they blessed the God of heaven. Verse 20, Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. He changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and in the light dwelleth with him. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who hast given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me what we desired of thee, for thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. So when we take a look at this issue, Arioch comes in, Daniel says, what's going on? Arioch tells him, and he says, well, I want to go back to my guys, and we're going to pray, and God's going to reveal us this information. And that's exactly what takes place. Now, does Joshua know about this situation here? No. But does Joshua know something about the one who can reveal secrets? Joseph. I don't know why I keep saying that, but Joseph. Thank you. All right. Back in Genesis chapter 40. I've got Jacob on my mind for some reason. Rest of Genesis is all Joseph, so I don't know why I'm doing that, but so then when we come here in chapter 40, verse 7, notice And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his lord's house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sadly today? And they said unto him, We have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. So Joseph knows something about the one to whom the interpretations belong to, right? And he says, Tell me what the dreams are. Now this is where they're going to start telling the dreams. Verse 9. And the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, In my dream, behold, a vine was before me. And in the vine were 3 branches. And it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said unto him, This is the interpretation of it. So when we take a look at this, this is the same thing that we saw back over there in Daniel chapter 2, verse 36, right? Here's the interpretation. God's going to give the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. Is there any doubt what the 3 branches represent? No. Verse 13, Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head, and restore thee unto thy place, and thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand after the former manner when thou wast his butler. So he's telling him, here's what you're going to do. Verse 14, But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head. Now, here you've got the butler tells his dream, and what Joseph gives him is good news. And so the baker's like, well, man, that's pretty good. I can't wait to hear mine. Spoiler alert, right? Notice verse 17. And in the uppermost basket there was all manner of baked meats for Pharaoh, and the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. And Joseph answered and said, This is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. Completely different response, right? Verse 20, And it came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he had made a feast unto all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Isn't that exactly what Joseph said was going to take place based on the dream? Yes. Now, there's a couple things that we're going to look at here. Notice in verse 22, But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Ye did not, the chief butler, remember Joseph, but forgot him. Now, we'll talk about that in a second. So you've got 2 different people that Joseph's in prison with, and what are they referred to as over and over and over again through chapter 40? Pharaoh's what? Huh? Well, they were butlers, right? Butler and the baker, they were servants, right? So it's an interesting thing, and this is something that we can take a look at too. If Joseph is a picture of Jesus Christ, the butler would be a picture of who? Thinking about what we already know about what's going to happen later on in this Bible that we know is already passed for us. What do we know? Who would the chief butler be a type of? Believing Israel, right? And who would the butler be, or the baker be a picture of? Unbelieving Israel, right? And so you kind of see those connections there. What's interesting to me is when you look back at verse 14, what is it? Do what?
No, that's made that spiritualized and to the max, and it works.
Yeah, I mean, because it would be a picture of them, right?
A lot of the Bible people spiritualize that is the ultimate, that it works.
Yeah. So I mean, you take a look at that, and you've got Joseph as a picture of Christ. Here you've got the butler as a picture of believing Israel, and you got the baker a picture of unbelieving Israel. And what happens is which one's exalted? Believing Israel. Which one's not? Right? Who's going to be sent to hell and all that? And of course, you get the idea of what? There's going to be two in the field. You get that same picture, right? One's going to be taken off into the kingdom. The other's going to be taken to judgment. So there's a bunch of different things that can go along with that. The main thing that I want to note is when Joseph interprets this dream for the butler. Notice in verse 13 he says, "Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head, and restore thee unto thy place, and thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand after the former manner, when thou wast a butler. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness." What is it that Joseph's asking the butler to do? Remember me. When you get back up in your position, remember me and remember I'm here. Right?
That kind of makes you think that he didn't understand that God had a plan.
Who? No, he does.
Well, I mean, he's asking the butler instead of asking God.
Well, and again, it's going to point back to, because we're going to see it in the next chapter, what actually takes place. And then you have that believing remnant remembering, hey, that was the guy, right? Well, it's just, he says, but think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. So he's asking him to say to Pharaoh, remember me, I'm down here in prison, and see if you can get him to bring me out of the house. So he's kind of asking for something. And you notice verse 15, the reason he does that, it says, "For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon." What's he asking the butler to go back and do? Go back and tell Pharaoh that he's innocent. Right? Well, everybody's in prison since, right? But he actually is. He's the one that did. But that's what he's asking, right? He's saying, I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I've done nothing that they should put me in the dungeon. What I'm asking you is to go back and talk to Pharaoh and see if you can get him to listen to you and bring me out of this, and tell him, hey, that guy, that Joseph that we've got down there, he's actually innocent.
Would it be fair to say that God gave the dream to the butler and the baker?
Mm-hmm.
That, because people use it all the time in belief.
Yeah.
I gave you a dream.
Yeah. Yeah.
But God did do that.
In this case, yeah. Because he's the one, and it's the same way with Nebuchadnezzar and all the other folks, because God's communicating doctrine, right? And that's what he's going to end up doing there. Now,
God was operating that way back then, where he's not operating that way today.
yeah. And you think like with Acts chapter 2. In Acts chapter 2, what's one of the promises? Not only speaking in tongues, but what? You're going to dream dreams and all that stuff. Well, who's going to be the one that gives the dreams and the interpretation of? It's going to be God, right? So he's going to supernaturally work that way in Acts chapter 2 and going on through Pentecost and going on through that tribulation period. And of course, since we know that what's taking place today, God doesn't have to do that, because now we've got a completed Bible. They didn't at that time, and they didn't in Acts chapter 2, right? And so there's some of those things. And it's interesting because in verse 14, he asks him, when you go back, show me some kindness and tell the Pharaoh, see if you can get me out. Now, drop down to verse 23. What happens is the butler's, he's got his position restored, right? Verse 23, "Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him." He does in chapter 41, yeah, and we'll talk about that in a second. But when you take a look at that, he's asking him, hey, could you remember me? Bring me up to Pharaoh and tell him that guy's innocent. Because that's what he brings up in verse 15, right? And of course, we see the chief baker, he's hanged, and the butler is restored, right? So in chapter 40, again, we've got this issue of we know that Joseph, he's suffering innocently. He's confined. He's going through this. He's suffering, doing all that stuff. But does he know something on the other side? And we should remember, did he, when he got his dream and he told the interpretation to his brothers and his mom and dad and all that stuff, does he know that dream's true? He does, right? Now, chapter 41. Chapter 41, we get into the issue of the Pharaoh's going to have a dream, right? Verse 1, and it came to pass at the end of 2 full years, the Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. Now, here we are, what? 2 years after, when he says, and it came to pass at the end of 2 full years, the Pharaoh dreamed. So, is that 2 years after the chief butler getting put back in a position, or is it 2 full years from the time that Joseph was placed in a prison? However you want to go about that. I mean, he's placed in a prison. 3 days later, you've got Pharaoh's birthday, and then they do all those things 3 days later, and here we are 2 years after that, right? So if you want to make it 2 years or 2 years and 3 days, it's 2 years, right? But what happens is, how long has Joseph been in prison? Right? So when we take a look at this, he says, that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine and fat-fleshed, and they fed in a meadow. Now, kine is a what? It's a cow, right? So you've got what? You've got 7 well-favored kine and fat flesh, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat kine, so Pharaoh awoke. So that's the first time that Pharaoh has this dream, and he's going to have another one here in just a second. So what he's got is what? 7 cows, good health. They're eating. They're in the meadow. They're eating. They're fed. They're well fed. Then you got the 7 kine that are not well fed. And is it any shock that it's a cow that he's talking about there? What's one of the things that when Israel gets out of the land of Egypt on the other side, what is it that they make when they're waiting for Moses up there? Is they make that golden calf, right? Now, why did they do that? Is because they've come from a place that worshipped the calf. Well, the calf goes all the way back to Genesis 3, and who's the calf in Genesis chapter 3 is Satan. Of course, we know that that's what it all goes back to. So it wouldn't be shocking for Egypt to be worshiping a cow. Yeah, because that's part of who he is, right? As Lucifer, he was one of his 4 faces was the face of an ox. So here Pharaoh awakes, right? Verse 5, and he slept and dreamed the second time, and behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 thin ears and blasted with the east wind sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears, and Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Now first you have cows eating cows. Here you've got corn eating corn. Now we know that it's not possible for corn to eat corn. So there's something else that's taking place, right? And he wakes up out of this dream. Verse 8. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof, and Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. Now, this is different than Nebuchadnezzar, because Nebuchadnezzar says what? Tell me the dream and the interpretation. Here, Pharaoh tells the magicians and all the wise men of Egypt, here's my dream, tell me what it is. And what we find out is none of them could interpret that dream. Why? Because do not interpretations belong to God. Are any of the magicians or the wise men of Egypt, are any of them worshiping of God? The God of heaven? No, and that's why they don't have that, right? Now notice in verse 9. Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Now what's he reminding himself of? 2 years later, he says, oh yeah, There's this guy, Joseph. And he's forgotten about him until this time, and he's remembering because of the dream that Pharaoh has. Verse 10, Pharaoh was wroth with his servants and put me inward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night, I and he, we dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was there with us a young man, an Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream he did interpret. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. So he's just going through this issue of reminding himself and telling the Pharaoh, well, there's this guy down here in prison. He was a Hebrew, a servant of the captain guard. And he told him this, and he says, notice in verse 14, Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it, and I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Now, what's interesting is who is it that Joseph gives the credit for the interpretation? God, not himself. He says what? It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. It's not me. I'm not the thing. I'm not the one that it's coming from. It's coming from God, right? Verse 17, And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, In my dream, behold, I stood upon the bank of the river, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, fat-fleshed and well-favored, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them, poor and very ill-favored and lean-fleshed, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for badness. And the lean and the ill-favored kine did eat up the first 7 fat kine. And when they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them, but they were still ill-favored as at the beginning, so I awoke. Now, when we take a look at that, do we notice something that we didn't see in the previous verses up in verse 4? So he added some more information. What did he add there? Not just that the lean ones ate the fat ones, but what? You couldn't tell them. They're still lean, right? And so then he says, but they were still ill-favored as at the beginning, so I awoke. And I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 ears came up in one stalk, full and good. And behold, 7 ears withered thin, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears. And I told this unto the magicians, but there was none that could declare it to me. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, The dream of Pharaoh is one. God hath showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good kine are 7 good years, and the 7 good ears are 7 good years. The dream is one. And he's reminding him what? It's not 2 separate dreams. They're both going to be saying the exact same thing. What's he say about the 7 kine or 7 good years? The good corn is 7 good years, right? Verse 27, And the 7 thin and ill-favored kine that came up after them were 7 years, and that the 7 empty ears blasted with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. So what's he telling him? You're going to have 7 good years. What's going to follow those 7 good years? 7 bad years. 7 bad years of famine. Now, it's not like, well, God's going to do something in your life for 7 days or 7 years. He's talking specifically about this right here. You're going to have 7 good years. You're going to have 7 bad years. And that's exactly what the interpretation is, right? Verse 28. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. Behold, there come 7 years of good plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. And the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous. Now you think about what's taking place there. He's saying what? You're going to have 7 good years, and by the time you get into the 7 bad years, you're not even going to remember the 7 good years. That's how bad it's going. And then he says, and the plenty shall not be known in verse 31, shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous. So you got 7 good years. By the time you're in the 7 bad years, you're not even going to remember the 7 good years. It's going to be that bad, right? Verse 32, and for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now he says, why did God bring it up twice? It's a done deal. Have you ever seen where, throughout Scripture, and this happens a lot, have you ever seen if God says something, if he repeats himself, you might want to pay attention, right? And so then that's kind of established back here already. But notice, this thing's established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore let Pharaoh look out, a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years, and let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. So he's asking him to do what? Let's establish a group of people that's going to be able to take care of this stuff. We're going to take a 5th of the part of the land, whatever that part of the land produces. We're going to keep it, and we're going to store it up. Right? Verse 35, and let them gather all the food of those good years, and come and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh, and the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Now, what's he get because of this interpretation of the dream? What does Joseph find himself in right now? A position of favor and authority, right? Yeah, to be able to discern, yeah. So when you take a look at this, what's the qualification that Pharaoh puts on the man that they're going to find? Verse 38 he says, can we find such an one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? Now, we've already seen Joseph's exaltation prior to this, and here we see it again. Why is it that the Pharaoh puts him in that position? Is why he recognizes in whom the Spirit of God is. He recognizes something about Joseph, right? Why? Who is it that gave him the interpretation? Only God can do that, right? And then all that's kind of coming together. I don't know if it ever says a particular name, which one it would be. It would be the same one that he would have. I don't know if it would have been Potiphar, or the one that was under Potiphar, the one that Potiphar worked for. I don't know if we don't see like a specific name with it. And I would say since we're within a couple years of that, no, it wouldn't be Nebuchadnezzar, no. All right. Now, verse 40. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. Now, you stop and you think, isn't that the position that Joseph had before he was thrown into jail because of Potiphar's wife? And if you remember, if you go back to chapter 39, what's he say to Potiphar's wife in verse 9 is what? There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this this great wickedness and sin against God? He's got this position, and Pharaoh says, what? I'm going to give you over my house, and the only person that's greater than you is myself. All right, and so he's in the same position that he was before. Verse 41, and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, Bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift his hand or foot in the land of Egypt. So again, we take a look at this. Joseph's back in this position of authority, in favor, and he's got all this because of the interpretation. And what is it? Is it because he's something special? No, it's because God gave him interpretation. It's God working through him to do that. And it's his faith in what God tells him about that. He's saying, here's what God's saying. Right?
It hasn't happened yet. Pharaoh's doing all this to him, so obviously he believes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or did God kind of nudge Pharaoh?
Well,
I mean, he gave him the dream.
well, he gave, huh?
The nudge was the dream.
Yeah, the nudge was the dream, and the fact that he gave him the interpretation, that would have given him the. I know that the Spirit of God's in this one because he's actually giving an interpretation when all my other guys couldn't.
Would it be fair to say God's going to cause famine? He's going to cause plenty of perseverance within famine just to get Joseph in that position? I mean, that's kind of what's happening here.
Well, he's got position before it even happened. It's just he just believes.
I'm
Because
talking
Joseph could have.
about Joseph.
He got the position because of the dream interpretation.
Right.
Yeah.
God wanted him.
His position restored.
Yeah, he's going to get his position restored because when you look back to your point in verse 38, he says, This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh, what God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. This is what God's going to do, but he's telling you beforehand, this is what I'm doing.
So this is just to drive Israel to Egypt? That's basically what we're talking about. Because that's the old.
Perhaps because you still have this issue of suffering and then glory, and then when they go into Egypt, they have suffering and then glory. Yeah, well, they never get to the glory, but no, you're fine.
Well, I know
But I would see it would be a foretaste of that. Yeah.
God wanted Israel to be in bondage for 400 years.
Well, that's part of it that there's a promise that they're going to be in captivity for 400 years.
What was that?
Um,
I just know when you read the story, it's not like God is saying, okay, these Israelites need to go into captivity for 400 years, and then that presents Moses. I've heard it talked about different ways, but I don't know. Ahead of myself, I should
no, you're fine. Because we talked about that a little while back. Off the top of my head, I can't remember where it was, but it was already spoken of that they were going to. I was thinking it was.
I know he talked about, he said when Joseph was dying, and he spoke of him coming out of Egypt or something like that.
Coming out of Egypt.
Yeah,
Yeah.
leaned upon his cane or something.
Because I remember us talking about that, and then I'm drawing a blank right now, but yeah, it was already spoken to them that they were gonna be in captivity for 400 years. Well, I'll find that in a second, but so he knows that that's coming. Yeah, and that would be a fulfillment of that prophecy that was already spoken to them. I was thinking it was Abram or Abraham, but I've lost the. I'll find it here in a minute. But that gets us up to the point where Joseph is finally going to be rejected by his brethren, and we kind of see some stuff that gets through there. Because I know we're running late on time, but It's going to drive me crazy till I actually think of it again. Yeah, I'll look for it again. But that gets us up to that part, and I'll keep looking for that. Once I get it, we'll talk about that. But any other questions, comments, or concerns up through that what we've gotten so far?
Just that, when Paul says all scripture is profitable, right? When you start, for all the folks out there that just completely reject rightly dividing, if you start going from the beginning of this Bible and you work your way through it, it just is so obvious how God worked differently with people in different ages of the Bible. It's just so obvious through these things that went on and how he operated. And like it's right there in front of you to see.
Yeah,
And we've got so many people that just completely reject the idea.
yeah,
You know what I mean? But
Yeah.
as you go through it, it's all right there. You see how he operated.
yeah,
Now, it's different than it is today because they didn't have the Bible. We have the Bible.
Mhm.
So you had to operate differently. I don't know. My point is, it just becomes real obvious if you'll just see it.
yeah. And the thing is that issue of when you have the Bible, whatever God says, that's what He's holding you accountable to, right? So, Mark, Genesis 15:13, and he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. So that was a promise that he made back in chapter 15. So that would have been something that God's already promised that Israel's going to go through that. So that's something that they're going to have. So that's still in their future. So it would be moving towards that end. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question.
Have any idea why you want like a punishment or something?
Is it a punishment for something? Perhaps. I mean, you think about from Abram to this point. Abraham, how good was he? Isaac, how good was he? Jacob, how good was he? Now you're down to Jacob's children. You got Joseph and all this stuff. So you take a look at all that stuff. It's part of the promise that God makes to Abram there prior to. What's interesting about that is he makes that promise to them about going into Egyptian captivity prior to the. He's already called him out, but it's prior to the circumcision, right? But he's telling them, know of a surety that this is going to take place, that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out of the great substance, and thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. So the purpose of him sending them there is to do what? To judge the nation that they're serving, and then make them of a great substance. So it's to make them be the nation that it's a way for him to show he is God.
400 years is long.
It is. Yeah.
I mean, it looks like you could done it in 20 years.
Well, I mean, you think about when they come out though, they're multiplied by that time, right? And they've gone through, and he's shown. In fact, what he does is he shows himself against the 10 gods that Egypt has and all that stuff too. So.
If you didn't have that story, you wouldn't have Moses, you wouldn't have the Red Sea, you
Well,
wouldn't have wandered in the wilderness.
you wouldn't have the blood on the doorposts. There's a purpose behind all of that. Punishment might be part of it, but a lot of it is to show his plan, his wisdom. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm.
We're curious what those people during that time in Egypt thought about all this. Did they know prophecy? Did they know Genesis?
I think it could possibly be the same type of thing of Satan. I know what the Bible says, but I don't believe what it says, and it could be possibly that. Because you got a lot of folks. Would everybody in Egypt known maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure. But if they know the Bible, they may not believe it. Well, that's what it says, but that's just an archaic scroll that we've not written. So,
Yeah, well, as you made the comment, when you're going through something, time it's about slow.
mhm.
So, you might have read it, but you're.
Yeah. Well, and Egypt's not the ones that's going through the tough time, right? It's the nation of Israel. So, but yeah, that I think it would be as far as, are you talking about the Israel in Egypt? I would say that there would have been a lot of them that did, and that's why some of them did have the blood on their doorposts and some didn't. Yeah. So I would think that that would go along with that. Yeah. Because some would look at the situation they're in like, well, this is what God promised to Abram, and they should know that. And then others are going to be like, yeah, that's what it says, but some of them would have been slaves their whole life, yeah, by the time you get to that point. And again, it's that idea of, when you look back, it's like, for instance, like with the book of Judges, right? You had one generation that came out of Egypt, so they know exactly what it was. You get a couple generations down, they didn't go through all that stuff, and they're like, well, that's what he says, but I don't believe that's what it is. So it's that same kind of thing as showing that generational issue of passing along the scriptures themselves, yeah. Which would be the preservation of what God says, too. So there's a whole bunch of stuff with that, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's the point, right? Even though Joseph knows that he's going to be above his brethren, at this time he's not. He knows the verses. He knows what God told him and all that stuff in the dream. So he knows that he's not there yet, so something else must be going on too. But yeah, it's no matter what the circumstance around you looks like, trust what God's word says. Just because the circumstance says that's not true doesn't mean it's not true. Right? So that's a good point.